In the spring of 1944, somewhere along the collapsing seams of the European front, a German infantryman found himself exposed in a way training could not prepare him for. The ground around him was torn and unfamiliar, the air fractured by artillery he could no longer place. Only months earlier, he had stood on the opposite side of the wire, armed, confident, and in control, one of many soldiers whose duty was to take prisoners and move on. Now, pinned by fire and cut off from his unit, he was simply a man running out of time. War had taught him the usual lessons. Survival belonged to those who knew their weapons, trusted their instincts, and were fortunate enough to be missed. Doctrine said nothing about mercy. It said nothing about memory. Like most soldiers, he believed that once captured, lines were permanent, that enemies remained enemies, and that fate followed uniforms without exception. On the battlefield, belief was often all a man had. Then came the irony that no field manual could account for. Movement appeared where death should have followed. Figures emerged cautiously through smoke and hedgerow Allied soldiers advancing under fire, not toward victory, but toward him. As they reached him, recognition passed without words. These were men he had once guarded, marched, and handed over alive. Now, with shells falling closer, they chose to return that debt, lifting him from the ground and pulling him back through danger that did not belong to them. The struggle that followed was brief and absolute. Bullets cut the air. Orders were shouted and lost. There was no ceremony in the act, only urgency. Each step away from the killing ground carried risk for men who had no obligation to take it. In war, such moments were rare because they demanded something beyond obedience, something quieter and far more difficult. What revealed itself in those minutes was not strategy, but humanity pressed into its narrowest margin. The battlefield, so often reduced to arrows and casualty counts, became instead a place where memory outweighed allegiance, and where a former captor was treated simply as a life worth preserving. As they disappeared into cover, the war resumed its familiar rhythm. But somewhere ahead, another choice far larger and far deadlier was already taking shape, waiting to test whether such moments were exceptions or warnings. To the men he once guarded, the German soldier had been less an individual than a symbol. His uniform represented authority, confinement, and the quiet fear that accompanied captivity. He had spoken little, followed orders, and enforced rules that needed no explanation. In war, such figures were remembered not for their names, but for what they embodied: the power of an enemy system made visible in a single man. When fate reversed their positions, shock replaced certainty. The former prisoners now stood free, armed, and faced with a decision no command structure could resolve for them. The man who had once determined their movements lay exposed and wounded, separated from his own lines. No one would question what happened next. War allowed for silence. It allowed for indifference, and it rarely punished those who chose either. The irony was stark and unescapable. The same hands that had once checked documents and locked doors now reached upward in helplessness. For the men watching him, memory pressed in from every direction: nights spent waiting, the humiliation of dependence, the constant awareness of being owned by someone else's will. And yet, the battlefield had reduced all of that to a single immediate fact: a human life balanced against the weight of resentment. The struggle was not only physical, it unfolded inside the mind, where past grievances argued against present danger. Every second spent deciding increased the risk to everyone involved. Enemy fire did not pause for reflection. Survival demanded action, even when the heart resisted it. In that narrow window, the men chose neither revenge nor forgetfulness, but something more difficult: a temporary suspension of judgment. What emerged from that moment was not forgiveness, and certainly not absolution. It was recognition. Beneath the uniform was a man as exposed to fear and death as anyone else on the field. The war had not erased moral boundaries, but it had blurred them enough to reveal their fragility. As they moved on together, the decision lingered unspoken, unresolved. And somewhere beyond the smoke and hedgerows, the war was preparing to ask a far harsher question, one that would not be answered by individuals, but by nations. The moment came without warning, as such moments often did in war. The German soldier lay exposed on the edge of a contested field, wounded and unable to move with speed or purpose. Fire swept the ground in uneven bursts, turning open space into a narrow corridor of survival. In that instant, rank and allegiance offered no protection. He was vulnerable in the most absolute sense, dependent on whether others would choose to see him or step past him. Experience suggested that past actions carried consequences that could not be undone. The war had taught men to remember who had held power and who had suffered beneath it. Yet belief, even in wartime, was not fixed. There existed the possibility that choice could interrupt history, that moral courage might surface where vengeance was expected. Such beliefs were fragile, easily crushed by fear, but they had not disappeared. The irony lay in who now controlled the outcome. The soldiers moving nearby had once endured his authority, his orders, his indifference. They knew what it meant to be powerless while he stood armed and unthreatened. Now the roles were reversed. Empathy, in that setting, was not natural. It ran against the current of the war and the habits it enforced. To act was to defy not just danger, but instinct. The struggle unfolded in seconds that felt far longer. Every glance toward the wounded man invited return fire. Every pause risked discovery. The decision to intervene carried consequences that were immediate and personal. Fear argued for distance. Memory argued for restraint. And yet, neither could erase the reality unfolding on the ground. A man would live or die based on what they chose to do next. What followed would not resemble reconciliation. It would not resolve the war's injustices or soften its brutality, but it would set the stage for something rare, a reunion defined not by uniforms or past harm, but by the shared urgency of survival. In that fragile convergence, loyalty and morality were about to be rewritten, not by orders from above, but by actions taken under fire. And as the battlefield shifted once more, the consequences of that choice began to ripple outward toward an encounter that neither side could have anticipated. The men understood the risk immediately. To intervene on behalf of a German soldier was not only dangerous, it was complicated. Lines at the front were fragile, and trust among comrades depended on clarity of purpose. Any attempt to aid the enemy could be misread in the confusion of combat, with consequences that extended well beyond the battlefield. They knew that survival in war often depended on being understood by those fighting beside you. Yet shock accompanied the choice they made. Against the momentum of fear and doctrine, they moved forward. There was no debate, no signal from above, only a shared decision formed in silence. In a conflict defined by orders and obedience, this was an act without instruction. Moral courage, in that moment, did not announce itself. It simply acted. The irony was unmistakable. For years, heroism had been measured in advances taken and enemies neutralized. Here, bravery was redefined by restraint. To preserve a life rather than end one required exposure, patience, and an acceptance of risk without reward. The German soldier, once a figure of authority, now depended entirely on the resolve of those who had every reason to abandon him. The struggle unfolded in fragments. Gunfire echoed across broken ground as the men coordinated their movements with gestures and brief commands. Every step had to be calculated. A pause could draw fire. A misstep could end the effort entirely. The wounded man was lifted, then lowered, then lifted again. His weight a constant reminder that hesitation was as dangerous as haste. Around them, the battle showed no awareness of their purpose. Uncertainty pressed in from all sides. Would their own lines recognize their intent? Would the enemy detect movement and respond? War rarely allowed space for explanation, and none was available now. The rescue tested not only their nerve, but their discipline, the ability to remain focused while everything around them urged retreat. What revealed itself in those minutes was the enduring power of ethical choice. Compassion, so often dismissed as impractical in war, became the very thing that guided them through chaos. It did not weaken their resolve. It sharpened it. In choosing to save an enemy, they affirmed something the war had tried relentlessly to erase, that humanity could survive even here. As they reached cover and the noise shifted behind them, the decision lingered in the air, unresolved. Ahead lay consequences no one could predict, and an encounter that would demand more than courage, it would demand reckoning. The danger was immediate and unmistakable. As the men advanced, the ground ahead offered no certainty, only exposure. Bullets cracked overhead. Mines lay unseen beneath churned soil, and the terrain itself seemed designed to punish movement. Every step into the open brought them closer to the wounded German soldier and farther from safety. In war, such decisions were usually reserved for objectives of strategic value. This one was made for a single life. They knew what each movement might cost. Combat stripped away illusions quickly, and none of them believed in invulnerability. Pressing forward meant accepting that injury or death could come without warning, without meaning. Yet belief carried them onward, the belief that action, once chosen, had to be completed. Hesitation would only compound the risk, turning resolve into vulnerability. The irony was visible in the way they formed around the fallen man. Those who had once learned to keep their distance now closed ranks in protection. The fear he had inspired during captivity had long since lost its power. In its place stood a recognition that courage did not belong to one side alone. By becoming his shield, they redefined their own experience of the war, transforming memory into purpose. The struggle tested every skill they possessed. Routes had to be judged in seconds. Cover was scarce, and communication was reduced to glances and brief signals. A sudden burst of fire forced them to halt, then adjust, then move again. The wounded man slowed them, his weight and condition demanding care in a place where speed was survival. Combat offered no allowances for mercy. Unpredictability governed each moment. A shell landing too close, a misjudged step, a hidden threat beneath the soil, and he could end the effort instantly. Fear was constant, but it was managed, folded into the discipline that training had instilled. What mattered was momentum. Stopping meant becoming a target. Moving meant at least the possibility of escape. In those minutes, heroism took on a quieter form. There were no banners, no witnesses beyond the men involved. Victory was measured not in ground gained, but in distance covered without loss. To act ethically under such pressure required a resolve that could not be ordered or rewarded. As they neared relative cover and the noise of the battle shifted once more, the meaning of what they had done began to settle. The war would continue unchanged. But for those involved, the line between enemy and ally had blurred irrevocably, setting the stage for a reckoning that lay just ahead. Success now depended on details. Coordination, timing, and trust became more valuable than firepower. The men moved with practiced restraint, aware that any misstep could unravel what they had already risked so much to achieve. In war, rescues rarely followed plan or pattern. They unfolded instead through improvisation, shaped by terrain, noise, and the thin margin between movement and exposure. The German soldier was barely conscious. Shock and blood loss had narrowed his world to fragments, faces without context, hands lifting and steadying him, commands he could not place. Stripped of authority and strength, he relied entirely on those who had once suffered under his supervision. In that dependence lay a truth war seldom acknowledged. Power was temporary, and vulnerability universal. The irony could not be ignored. Men who had once waited for his permission to move now controlled every decision that mattered. His survival rested not on rank or uniform, but on their willingness to carry him farther than safety required. The war had inverted their roles completely, leaving only character to determine the outcome. Extraction tested them all. Fire pressed in from unpredictable angles, forcing sudden changes en route. A stretcher was improvised from what little could be spared. Each pause to adjust his position risked discovery. Each push forward demanded strength already stretched thin. Selflessness, in this context, was not abstract. It was measured in aching muscles and exposed backs. Trust became the silent foundation of the effort. No one questioned whether the others would move when needed or cover when required. There was no room for doubt. The wounded man sensed it too. Even through pain and confusion, a cohesion born not of allegiance, but of shared intent. Survival had become a collective task. When they finally reached relative cover, the battle did not stop. It simply moved elsewhere. Yet something had shifted. The act of rescue had carved out a brief space where enmity gave way to mutual respect, not spoken but understood. They had seen one another at their most exposed and responded with resolve rather than cruelty. As the German soldier was handed over and the men prepared to rejoin their units, the moment receded into the larger war. But its meaning endured, quietly, waiting to surface again when the conflict would demand not just courage in battle, but reckoning after it. The battlefield offered no pause for what they were attempting. Fire continued to rake the ground in irregular waves, each burst reshaping the space they had to cross. Smoke drifted low, obscuring landmarks and compressing distance until direction itself became uncertain. The rescue unfolded not in a moment of clarity, but inside a shifting storm of sound and movement that tested the limits of everyone involved. Struggle defined every second. Muscles burned under the weight of the wounded man, and balance had to be constantly recalibrated across broken earth. Explosions collapsed cover that had seemed reliable only moments before. Commands were reduced to gestures, shouted fragments swallowed by noise. Training mattered, but adaptability mattered more. The situation changed faster than doctrine could account for it. The irony of the task never fully receded. These soldiers had been trained to identify threats, to advance by neutralizing opposition. Now their instincts had to be restrained, redirected toward protection rather than destruction. The man they shielded had once stood in their way, uniformed and unyielding. In war, such reversals were rare. and when they occurred, they unsettled assumptions long taken for granted. Pressure intensified as the distance to safety refused to shrink. Every exposed crossing became a calculation speed against stealth, cover against momentum. A single mistake could draw fire not just onto the rescuers, but onto the wounded man who had no means of escape. Responsibility weighed heavily, sharpening focus while leaving no room for doubt. Fear existed, but it could not be allowed to lead. Coordination became instinctive. One man moved, another covered. A third watched the ground ahead, scanning for movement that did not belong. Skill, honed through months of survival, now served a purpose that training manuals had never anticipated. The rescue demanded precision without rehearsal, cooperation without command. It worked only because each man trusted the others to do exactly what was required. Amid the chaos, something quieter emerged. The wounded soldier, drifting in and out of awareness, sensed the discipline guiding him through danger. He felt the steadiness of hands that could have abandoned him. In that awareness lay an understanding that transcended language, the recognition that survival was no longer divided by sides. The battlefield pressed on, indifferent. Shells fell where they would. Bullets followed their trajectories without regard for intention. Yet within that indifference, humanity persisted. The men adapted routes, altered pace, and absorbed risk that logic alone could not justify. Vengeance offered no advantage here. Fear offered no solution. Only cooperation kept them moving. As they neared cover once more, exhaustion set in. Strength faded, but resolve held. The distance they had crossed was measured not in meters, but in restraint. Each choice to shield rather than strike had cost them time and safety. And yet, it had carried them forward. When the immediate danger finally loosened its grip, the rescue was not celebrated. There was no signal to mark its end. The men simply paused, catching breath, aware that what they had done could not be undone or fully explained. Ahead lay the reckoning of survival. Questions from comrades, suspicions, consequences. And beyond that, a war still unfinished, one that would test whether such moments of humanity could endure once the fire had passed. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible. At some point during the rescue, the German soldier ceased to exist as a symbol and became something else entirely. No longer an enemy, no longer a uniform. He was simply a wounded man breathing in short, uneven bursts. For the former prisoners, this recognition carried a quiet shock. War-trained men to see categories friend, foe, threat. Seeing beyond them required effort, and the cost of that effort was memory. They had learned to survive without expecting compassion. Captivity had taught them that power rarely softened itself. Yet belief, even after hardship, could still surface. In the harshest conditions imaginable, they found room for restraint. Compassion did not appear as sentiment or pardon. It appeared as discipline, the ability to act without surrendering to resentment. The irony of the moment was unmistakable. Those who had endured confinement, uncertainty, and loss now became agents of mercy. The narrative of enmity that war relied upon began to fracture. The German soldier, once a representative of their suffering, now depended on them for survival. The reversal was not complete, but it was enough to challenge assumptions long held as unbreakable. This shift did not come easily. Each man carried his own memories forward into the moment. The sound of locked doors, the weight of enforced obedience, the constant reminder of vulnerability, these were not erased by a single act. The struggle unfolded inwardly, where instinct argued against conscience. To act with mercy required not forgetting the past, but choosing not to be ruled by it. Such choices tested the moral compass more severely than combat itself. In battle, enemies were distant and abstract. Here, they were close, breathing, unmistakably human. The risk was not only physical, it was the risk of contradiction, of acting against the expectations placed upon them by the war, by comrades, and by their own history. What revealed itself through that contradiction was character. Ethical decisions in war rarely arrived with clarity. They emerged in fragments, shaped by fear, fatigue, and circumstance. The men did not act to redefine themselves, yet the act defined them nonetheless. Combat prowess measured what a soldier could do. Moral choice revealed who he was. The battlefield remained unchanged. Artillery still fell. Orders still arrived. The larger war moved forward, indifferent to small acts of restraint. And yet, within that indifference, something enduring took shape. The rescue did not alter strategy or outcome. It altered perspective. The German soldier, now safe from immediate danger, became a reminder that humanity survived not because war allowed it, but because individuals insisted upon it. mercy did not weaken resolve. It clarified it. It drew a line between necessity and excess, between survival and surrender of self. As the men separated and returned to their respective paths, the moment receded into memory. It would not be recorded in reports or commemorated in medals, but it would endure in quieter ways, shaping how they understood the war and their place within it. Ahead lay the final measure of such choices. When the fighting ended and uniforms were set aside, the question would remain: what had they carried through the war with them, and what had they refused to leave behind? The final stretch offered no relief. Exhaustion pressed heavily on every movement, turning simple actions into deliberate effort. The terrain narrowed, forcing them through exposed ground where cover was scarce and the risk immediate. Bullets still searched for targets, indifferent to intention or fatigue. Survival now depended on holding together for just a little longer. Struggle defined the extraction's last phase. Muscles stiffened, breath shortened, and attention narrowed to what lay directly ahead. A stumble could undo everything. The wounded German soldier, barely conscious, had become both burden and responsibility. His weight slowed them, but abandoning him was no longer conceivable. The choice had been made, and it demanded completion. Irony followed them, like a shadow. The man once feared by those around him now relied entirely on their endurance. Power had reversed itself completely. Where authority had once been enforced, trust now sustained him. In the harsh economy of war, such reversals were rare and fragile, dependent on moments that could easily slip away. Fire intensified without warning. A burst of shots forced them to drop low, pressing bodies and stretcher into the earth. Seconds stretched as they waited for an opening that might not come. The battlefield offered no guarantees, only intervals between dangers. When the pause arrived, they moved again, driven by the understanding that stopping meant failure. Fatigue eroded precision. Hands shook. Footing slipped. The effort demanded more than strength. It required discipline under strain. Each man adjusted his pace to the others, knowing that speed gained at the expense of cohesion would cost them everything. Survival was collective or not at all. The rescue crossed an invisible threshold as they reached the last stretch of relative safety. Cover grew closer, though not yet secure. The noise of the battle shifted, becoming less immediate, but no less threatening. One final push remained, and with it, the risk of losing what they had already preserved. When they finally cleared the danger, the moment did not announce itself. There was no signal, no clear line marking success, only the gradual realization that fire no longer tracked them, that movement could slow without consequence. The wounded man was alive. That fact, simple and unremarkable in another context, carried extraordinary weight here. In that survival lay the revelation. Courage had not appeared as defiance or conquest. It had emerged as persistence, steady, uncelebrated, and restrained. Ethics had not weakened resolve. They had guided it through chaos. The past roles each man had played in the war no longer defined the present outcome. The German soldier, conscious now in brief flashes, understood only fragments of what had occurred. Yet even those fragments carried meaning. He had been spared not by chance, but by choice, by men who had found reason to act beyond memory and beyond fear. As the rescue faded into the wider movement of the war, its significance remained localized and profound. It would not change the course of the conflict, but it had changed the course of a life, and perhaps the understanding of those who saved it. Ahead waited the final reckoning, not of battle, but of remembrance. When the war ended and stories were told, this moment would endure quietly, asking whether survival alone was enough, or whether how one survived mattered just as much. Survival, when it finally came, carried a quiet shock. The German soldier lived not because the battlefield spared him, but because men he once commanded to obey chose otherwise. In the logic of war, this outcome defied expectation. Oppression rarely returned mercy, and mercy was rarely extended to those who had enforced it. Yet here, against the weight of history and habit, survival had been granted. As the immediate danger receded, an uneasy belief took shape among those involved. Their lives, once separated by uniforms and authority, had intersected in a way no one could have predicted. What had begun as captivity and resentment now bound them together through shared risk. The war had forced that connection, but it had not dictated its meaning. The irony of the battlefield could not be ignored. Designed for division, it had produced a moment of reconciliation not through negotiation or forgiveness, but through action. Violence surrounded them still, yet within it, a different outcome had emerged. The very place that stripped men of individuality had briefly restored it. The turning point came without ceremony. As the wounded soldier stabilized, awareness replaced confusion. He looked at the men around him, not as guards or enemies, but as the reason he still breathed. No words were exchanged that could encompass the moment. Recognition passed silently, carried in glances and restraint. What mattered was understood without explanation. For the former prisoners, the shift was equally profound. The man they had once feared was no longer defined by his power over them. He was defined by his vulnerability and by their response to it. Shared humanity, long obscured by command and captivity, surfaced in the aftermath of danger. It did not erase the past, but it altered its hold on the present. This transformation did not resemble absolution. No debts were settled, no injustices undone. Instead, something subtler occurred. Personal history, shaped by coercion and survival, was rewritten at its edges. The rescue added a new chapter, one that complicated memory rather than replacing it. Acts of mercy rarely announce themselves as such in war. They emerge from fatigue, fear, and the narrowing of choice. Yet their impact can be lasting. For the men involved, this moment became a reference point proof that even within a system built on force, individual decisions still carried weight. The battlefield soon reclaimed its dominance. Orders resumed, units moved on. The rescued soldier was processed, treated, and absorbed back into the machinery of war. The men who saved him returned to their own paths, carrying the moment with them in ways that could not be articulated. And yet, the story endured, not as legend or official record, but as memory passed quietly, preserved unevenly. It resisted simplification. It asked questions rather than offering answers. Could mercy exist without forgiveness? Could survival carry moral meaning beyond strategy? The war would end, as all wars do, leaving behind numbers, ruins, and narratives shaped by outcome. But within that vast accounting, this small convergence remained intact. It stood as evidence that even in wartime, personal history was not fixed, that it could be altered by a single decision made under pressure. As time moved forward and the uniforms faded into the past, the memory of that choice persisted. It did not erase what had been suffered. It did not redeem the war, but it affirmed something enduring, that humanity, once recognized, could not be entirely undone. And somewhere beyond the battlefield, long after the guns fell silent, the question lingered how many other moments like this were lost to history, and what might they have changed if remembered. Time did what war could not. It placed distance between memory and immediacy, allowing events once defined by urgency to be approached with reflection. Decades after the rescue, the men found themselves facing one another again. No uniforms, no weapons, no danger pressing in from the edges. The struggle now was not survival, but recollection. What had once unfolded in seconds now demanded words. The setting could not have been more different. Peace had softened the spaces between them. Age had altered posture and pace, leaving only traces of the men they had been. Yet recognition came quickly. The past did not need introduction. It waited quietly, present in the way they measured each other, in the pauses before speech. The irony of the reunion was unmistakable. A former captor stood beside those he had once guarded, bound not by authority or fear, but by a shared moment of extraordinary risk. The bond between them had not been forged by ideology or allegiance. It had been sealed by a decision made under fire, when the future had narrowed to a single choice. Conversation moved slowly at first. They spoke of families, of years lived beyond the war, of paths taken once the fighting ended. But inevitably, memory drew them back. They returned to that day not to relive it, but to understand it. Each man carried his own version, shaped by position and fear. Together, those fragments formed a clearer picture. The turning point of their reflection came not in recounting danger, but in recognizing intent. They acknowledged what had been risked and why. The rescuers spoke of instinct tempered by restraint. The rescued man spoke of confusion. Then, realization of understanding. Too late, how completely his life had rested in their hands. In that exchange, the war lost some of its finality. Time offered perspective that the battlefield could not. The choices made that day no longer competed with survival. They could be examined for what they revealed. Courage, they realized, had taken many forms, advancing under fire, yes, but also resisting the easier path of indifference. Forgiveness, too, had revealed itself not as absolution, but as acknowledgement. What emerged from their reunion was not closure in any conventional sense. The past remained intact, with all its harm and complexity. Yet, its meaning had shifted. The rescue stood apart, no longer a contradiction, but a point of convergence, evidence that even in a war defined by dehumanization, individual agency endured. The men parted again, aware that such meetings were finite. Age had made that clear, but the reunion had affirmed something essential. The impact of their choice had not diminished with time. It had grown clearer, sharper in its implications. What had once seemed an anomaly now appeared as a measure of who they had been and who they had chosen to become. As they returned to their separate lives, the story remained. It resisted simplification, just as it always had. It was not a tale of enemies turned friends, nor of wrongs undone. It was a reminder that history was shaped not only by grand decisions, but by moments when individuals acted against expectation. And long after the reunion ended, the question lingered how many such choices had gone unseen, and how differently might we remember war if we looked for them. The reunion, quiet and unadorned, carried a shock of its own, not because it was dramatic, but because it existed at all. Men who had once stood on opposite sides of a war defined by brutality now shared space without fear or resentment. Their presence together testified to something resilient in human nature, an ability to endure trauma without becoming wholly defined by it. What had survived was not just memory, but the capacity to look beyond it. The irony of their bond was impossible to overlook. In wartime, they had represented opposing forces, bound by coercion and circumstance. In peace, they became symbols of moral courage, not because they denied the past, but because they had faced it without surrendering to hatred. Friendship, in this context, was not sentimental. It was earned through restraint, reflection, and the long passage of time. Their story reached others quietly, passed on through conversations, interviews, and retellings that resisted exaggeration. What moved people was not the danger of the rescue alone, but its aftermath, the decision to acknowledge one another as human beings long after the guns fell silent. For those who heard it, the account offered a turning point in how war itself could be understood. It suggested that humanity was not erased by conflict, only suppressed. The power of the story lay in its simplicity. No grand speeches had been made on the battlefield, no promises exchanged. Yet the choice to save a life had bridged a divide that ideology and violence could not close. Acts of humanity, it revealed, did not require permission or victory. They required only recognition of vulnerability, of shared mortality, of the limits of vengeance. Forgiveness, as their story demonstrated, was not a single moment but a process shaped over years. It did not mean forgetting harm or excusing injustice. It meant allowing the past to exist without dictating every future encounter. Compassion transformed their relationship not by erasing history, but by reframing it, adding a dimension that war alone could never sup. For those who encountered the story later, its lesson extended beyond the individuals involved. It challenged assumptions about inevitability, that enemies must remain enemies, that violence leaves no room for moral agency. The rescue, and the reconciliation that followed, stood as evidence that even in the most extreme circumstances, choice remained. Legacy, in this case, was not measured in monuments or citations. It lived in altered perspectives, in the way people reconsidered what courage looked like, in the understanding that forgiveness was not weakness, but discipline, a refusal to allow cruelty the final word. The battlefield where it all began had long since returned to quiet. Grass grew where shells had fallen. The geography of violence faded. Yet the moral terrain shaped by that single decision endured. It passed from the men themselves to those who listened, and then further still, shaped by interpretation and time. In the end, the lesson was neither simple nor comforting. Forgiveness did not redeem the war. Compassion did not undo suffering. But together, they revealed something essential, that even amid destruction, humanity could assert itself briefly, imperfectly, and with lasting consequence. And as their story continued to be told, it left behind a question that history still struggles to answer, whether the true measure of war lies not only in how it is fought, but in what we choose to carry forward once it ends. The consequences of that single decision extended far beyond the moment itself. What began as an improvised rescue under fire became a thread woven through decades of lives. One act, measured in minutes, reshaped relationships that would have otherwise remained defined by silence or resentment. In war, outcomes were usually counted in territory gained or lost. This one was measured in memory. Respect grew where none had been expected. The men who had once been divided by power and fear carried forward a shared understanding, subtle but enduring. It influenced how they spoke of the war, how they explained it to their families, and how they remembered their own roles within it. Reconciliation did not erase suffering, but it altered its afterlife. The irony of the ripple was striking. Military strategy aimed to impose order through force, yet this act achieved something force never could. It created continuity where rupture had been assumed. The rescue held no strategic value, changed no map, and influenced no campaign. And yet, its moral weight endured long after tactical victories faded into abstraction. Over time, the story accumulated meaning. It was told not as an anomaly, but as a point of reference. When discussed, it reframed conversations about enemy and ally, about obedience and agency. It reminded listeners that war did not strip individuals of choice, it merely obscured it. When clarity returned, the decision stood as proof that humanity had never fully vanished. What the act revealed was not perfection, but possibility. Even in environments designed to dehumanize, individuals could resist becoming instruments alone. Courage, in this sense, was not loud. It did not seek recognition. It persisted quietly, shaping how people related to one another long after the danger passed. The German soldier carried the impact in ways unseen. Survival itself was only the beginning. Knowing that his life had been spared by those he once held captive, forced a reckoning that no post-war trial or doctrine could impose. It demanded reflection, not imposed from outside, but arising from gratitude and humility. For the rescuers, the ripple moved differently. Their decision became part of how they understood themselves. It stood as a reminder that even under orders, they had retained agency. That knowledge followed them into civilian life, influencing how they measured right and wrong beyond the battlefield. The revelation at the heart of the story was not that humanity could appear in war, but that it could survive it. The conditions had been among the most inhumane imaginable: violence, deprivation, fear, and yet, within them, compassion endured. It did not end the war, it did not redeem it, but it proved that something within human nature resisted complete erasure. As years passed, the ripple continued outward, touching those who encountered the story long after the participants were gone. It shaped how war was remembered, not as a series of inevitable horrors, but as a landscape shaped by countless individual decisions, most unseen. In the end, the power of that single choice surpassed any battlefield success, not because it was greater in scale, but because it spoke to something enduring. It suggested that history was not only written by victories and defeats, but by moments when individuals chose to act with restraint in a world that rewarded the opposite. And as the story continued to be told, it carried a quiet challenge, asking whether, even in the darkest conditions, we might still recognize the opportunity to choose differently. The men who carried out the rescue did not return to applause or recognition. Their actions passed without citation, folded quietly into the larger machinery of a war that had little use for nuance. History, when it records heroism, often favors scale battles, won, ground taken, enemies defeated. What these men did fit none of those categories. And yet, its influence endured in ways no official account could measure. Their bravery was rooted not in spectacle, but in clarity. In a moment stripped of abstraction, they recognized a choice and acted upon it. No medals followed. No commendations arrived. The war moved on, indifferent to the moral complexity they had navigated. In that indifference lay the quiet irony of their heroism. It was precisely because their act resisted easy classification that it went largely uncelebrated. True heroism, as this story reveals, rarely announces itself. It emerges without witnesses, sustained by discipline rather than impulse. It asks for nothing in return. The rescuers did not frame their decision as exceptional. They spoke of it, when they spoke at all, as something that simply had to be done. In that restraint lay its power. The human element of their action outlasted the conflict that gave rise to it. Long after the weapons were laid aside, the memory of that choice shaped how the men understood themselves. It influenced how they spoke of the war, not as a place where morality disappeared, but as a place where it was tested to its limits. Their legacy lived not in monuments, but in perspective. The irony deepened with time. Weapons that once seemed decisive were eventually rendered obsolete. Victories that dominated headlines faded into context. Yet the rescue remained intact in memory, resistant to erosion. It endured because it spoke to something more durable than strategy, the capacity to choose restraint when violence was permitted, even expected. What the rescuers demonstrated was not moral perfection, but moral agency. They did not resolve the war's contradictions. They acted within them. Courage, in this sense, was not the absence of fear or anger. It was the refusal to let either dictate the final outcome. Mercy was not weakness. It was a deliberate act of control. Their story also reframed the idea of influence. Power in war is often understood as the ability to impose outcomes. But influence, as revealed here, operated differently. It traveled through time, shaping how others understood conflict, responsibility, and memory. It reminded those who heard it that ethical choice was not extinguished by circumstance. The rescuers themselves would not have claimed such significance. They returned to ordinary lives, carrying the moment quietly. That, too, was part of their heroism. They did not seek to define themselves by what they had done. They allowed the act to stand on its own, unadorned and unresolved. In the end, their legacy rested on a simple truth. Weapons determine who survives a battle. Victories determine how wars are remembered. But courage, mercy, and empathy determine how humanity endures. These men, largely unknown beyond the circle of those they touched, left behind something more lasting than triumph. Their heroism was unsung, not because it lacked importance, but because it resisted spectacle. It asked to be understood, not celebrated. And in that quiet resistance, it offered a final measure of what truly survives war. As history continues to weigh victories and defeats, their story remains waiting to be noticed, and asking whether the most enduring legacies are not forged in combat, but in conscience. He had once been their enemy, a uniformed figure in a system that thrived on control and obedience. To them, he had represented confinement, uncertainty, and the quiet erosion of freedom. On the battlefield years later, he became something else entirely, a wounded man, exposed and dependent, whose life now rested in the hands of those he had once guarded. In that reversal lay the moral center of this story. The decision to save him had not erased the past. It did not absolve the suffering of captivity or soften the realities of war. Yet it altered the future in a way no victory or defeat ever could. By risking everything to preserve his life, they chose a path that defied vengeance and expectation alike. It was not an act meant to be remembered. It was simply an act that felt necessary. Decades later, when they met again, the war felt distant but not forgotten. Time had stripped away the urgency, leaving space for reflection. The men who stood together were no longer defined by ranks or roles. Age had replaced youth, and memory had tempered anger. What remained was a shared understanding shaped by a moment that neither side could dismiss. Their reunion carried no ceremony. There were no speeches meant for history, no attempt to frame what had happened as symbolic. Instead, there was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that their lives had intersected in a way that could not be undone. The bond between them was not built on friendship in the conventional sense, but on something sturdier, mutual survival, and the knowledge of what had been risked. What transformed captor and captives into friends was not forgiveness offered lightly, nor guilt demanded heavily. It was the recognition of shared humanity, discovered at the edge of death and preserved through time. They spoke not of ideology, but of consequence, not of enemies, but of choices. The war had taken much from all of them. It had not taken that moment. This story endures because it resists simplification. It does not suggest that war redeems itself through isolated acts of mercy. It does not claim that suffering can be balanced or erased. Instead, it reveals something quieter and more demanding, that morality does not vanish under pressure, and that courage can take the form of restraint rather than force. The men returned to their lives, carrying this truth. It shaped how they remembered the war and how they explained it to others. In a conflict defined by destruction, they carried proof that something else had existed alongside it. Not victory, not justice, but humanity. History often records what is loudest. Battles, strategies, and outcomes dominate the narrative. Stories like this one survive only when they are told deliberately, passed on because someone recognizes their weight. This is one such story. It does not change the war's outcome. It changes how we understand it. He was once their enemy, their prisoner, and yet they risked everything to save him. Decades later, they reunited as friends. In the heart of war, they found humanity, and it lasted a lifetime.